Welcome to Vanadium. The more I learn about the world, the more mysterious it seems to me. Lately, even in the popular press, there's this idea that consciousness is not just this thing that just exists in our heads. It's an integral part of the cosmos. So the idea of the double slit experiment, it's been around a while. But I think its implications are only really now becoming clear to really scientists. So this idea, this observer effect, the observer has an effect on the universe, is actually sort of making the universe, unfolding the universe. And then there's the idea of simulation theory, which is really the universe is just sort of built around our consciousness for some sort of reason. There's this idea of the many worlds interpretation by Hugh Everett, a really beautiful theory. He was actually the founding member of the band Eels. The whole idea is that, we have, things in physical reality, but maybe the universe has some sort of a separate characteristic that's meant just for consciousness. Maybe there's something like we need something like a new physical concept, like space or time. And maybe that's something like meaning. So, there's idea of signs, divine prophecies. This idea didn't start in the West. There's a practice called the I Ching, and what I'm showing is a series of hexagrams.
The I Ching is a divinatory system, and it consists of a series of 64 hexagrams consisting of broken and unbroken lines. And originally it required 50 stems from the yarrow plant, and you'd have to kind of carefully arrange these stems in your hand. You'd have long stems and short stems, and you kind of mix them up, and you'd use this process to create randomness, and it was extremely laborious and time-consuming. So now primarily 3 copper coins are used instead of the 50 stems from the yarrow plant. I didn't even know what a yarrow plant was. So I'll show you how you can actually use coins to give you hexagrams. So you can do essentially a reading like you would in astrology. But what's interesting about the I Ching is that it seems to have a lot more insight. It seems to yield a lot more insight than astrology does. And I know I'm going to get a lot of complaints on that. I'm not a fan of astrology. But the I Ching is something that the more I find out about it, the more exciting it seems to me. So the whole idea is that you're trying to read these patterns of acausal connectedness, and you're using sort of these anomalies in randomness to guide your analysis and your decision making, and you can predict the future. So this is the I Ching shows this coordination of the mind and the 3D world. So this goes along the lines of synchronicity, the idea that we're not sort of all alone, just sort of floating in the cosmos randomly. We're driving this. And what's really interesting is the question that the I Ching brings up. Were the ancient Chinese ahead of modern physics in terms of their understanding of time and patterns in nature? The ancient Chinese have this idea, and it's still around, the Tao. And this idea the Tao is a force of flux that builds and destroys all structures in the universe. So this, by structures, means, human bodies, social structures, physical structures, matter. So it's really everything. And so Terence McKenna really does a great job of summarizing the I Ching, and he is really he's the primary sort of resource, I think, in the Western world on the I Ching, and he's certainly an evangelist and one of the best speakers that you will ever. I mean, after you hear him speak, you're going to be like, this guy on Vanadium is an idiot. So the I Ching, I'm going to do some more work on this and report back in, because there's something going on here. And I remember once I was in the airport, the San Francisco airport, and I saw a man who looked like a businessman. And he was sitting, and it turned out he was actually consulting the I Ching, but he was using dice and consulting this sort of complex chart, and I found out those were the hexagrams. And this guy, you would think he was betting everything in his bank account on what was going on, because he was so transfixed and so focused on the results of this reading. And he was this was, 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was clearly like we were a bunch of business travelers. So this guy was going to some kind of look to me. He looked like he was going to a fancy meeting somewhere. So this was not a random weirdo. This is a guy that is getting through life. And it seemed to me that, and maybe I'm reading into this, but he was using the I Ching to sort of give him some information that he really needed. So that's what I want to start doing. I want to see if there are any kind of patterns in this randomness.
This idea really didn't come into the West in prominence, I guess, until a madman genius, Carl Gustav Jung. Everybody's probably most familiar with Carl Jung with the Myers-Briggs personality test. So I am an INTJ. So if anybody wants to look that up, it's really interesting. And actually, I was never a big fan of these sorts of tests, and I never would imagine to get any kind of insight or really any kind of useful information. But when I took the test, I found, even as I was looking at the questions and I was evaluating them, I was like, there's perhaps something to this. There's something maybe interesting going on here. So Carl Jung, he has a really sort of hardcore intellectual background. He comes from Vienna, which is sort of the hotbed for all, 20th century radical thought. And he was best friends with physicist Wolfgang Pauli, famous for the Pauli exclusion principle, which I'll go into a little bit later. He was an acquaintance of Albert Einstein, a student of Nietzsche, and there's mixed reviews on whether or not Nietzsche thought he was a very promising student or not. He was a frenemy of Freud. He was a student of Freud for a while, and then they parted ways over some significant differences in philosophical opinion. And he was a contemporary of Freud's nephew, one of the most underrated scumbags in world history, villain of the year, 1891 through 1995, Edward Bernays, father of modern advertising, really of all advertising, Edward Bernays. And I'm going to do a whole episode about him coming up. But right now, Carl Jung had this idea of synchronicity. So there would be events would unfold that would be designed by the universe to show you some sort of insight that you need. And it's this idea that there's an interplay with a person's consciousness or an animal's consciousness, or any kind of consciousness, and reality itself. Goes against the materialistic Richard Dawkins viewpoint. So what is a synchronicity? So a synchronicity, it's a coincidence, but it's a meaningful coincidence. So I think I'll give you some example of a meaningful coincidence. So I think the fact that math and numbers describe the universe and fit the universe so well and give us the ability to build things and predict the future and engineer complex devices, I think that's a meaningful coincidence, because that's just sort of an arbitrary system that we came up with that just keeps fitting the system better and better the more we look at it. So I would say math is a synchronicity. But it's the technical definition is it's an acausal connection in the form of meaningful coincidence. So there are some examples of things that are maybe borderline. I have written down here that are maybe coincidences but have some meaning to them. I wouldn't call them full synchronicities. So in 1940, Soviet archaeologists uncovered the tomb of Tamerlan, a descendant of Genghis Khan. An inscription on the tomb read, "Whoever opens my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than I." They, of course, opened it anyway, as any good scientist would, and Germany invaded the Soviet Union 2 days later. And we all know how World War II went. And what's interesting here on World War II, Stalin, Hitler were also in Vienna around the same time as Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli. So there was just a lot going on in the city of Vienna. And back then, the population wasn't that big. So it was like there was a lot of crazy stuff going on. So a synchronicity is basically the color of meaning. in the universe. If we were going to give or sort of a physical quantity, a synchronicity would be a quantum of meaning. There's a great, Carl Jung wrote a whole book on synchronicity, so I won't be able to do the topic justice in this session of Vanadium. But here's a great quote from his book on synchronicity. "We should not pretend to understand the world only by intellect. We apprehend it just as much by feeling. The judgment of the intellect is only part of the truth." Ain't that the truth? So this is Carl Jung's famous synchronicity that he'll cite, and people will cite about him, because he was first and foremost a therapist. And that's actually how he met Wolfgang Pauli, and I'm going to talk more about their relationship, which deserves, people have written books about that. But he was really first and foremost a therapist. He was interested in people and talking to people. And he tells this story here. I was sitting opposite of a patient one day, and her back was to the window, listening to her flow of rhetoric. She had an impressive dream the night before in which someone had given her a golden scarab, a costly piece of jewelry. While she was telling me this dream, I heard something gently behind me tapping on the window. I turned around and saw there was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window from outside in the obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed to me very strange. I opened the window and immediately caught the insect in the air as it flew in. It was a scarab beetle, or a common rose chafer, whose gold-green color most nearly resembles that of a golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patient with the words, "Here is your scarab." This broke the ice of her intellectual resistance, and the result of the treatment can now be continued with satisfactory results. Now, I've heard him talk about this particular patient. She was apparently extremely, very intellectual and very materialistic in her worldview, and was not very open to the idea of even therapy. And this moment of this golden scarab and him just snapping it out of basically thin air convinced her, made her a true believer. So this is a story that's frequently cited with Carl Jung. So these are maybe a little bit off topic of synchronicities, but I just love Carl Jung so much. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. They will practice Indian yoga and all its exercises, observe a strict regimen of diet, learn the literature of the whole world, all because they cannot get on with themselves and not have the slightest faith that anything useful could ever come out of their own souls. Thus the soul has gradually been turned into a Nazareth from which nothing good can come. I like that one. It's kind of sad but true, I guess. Here's another good one. The unconscious is not just evil by nature. It is also the source of the highest good. Not only dark, but also light. Not only bestial, semi-human, and demonic, but superhuman, spiritual, and in the classical sense of the word, divine. So he was, first and foremost, not a negative guy. Not a negative guy at all. Well, he was a little bit cynical about politics, I suppose. Here's another good quote I like. "No nation keeps its word. A nation is a big, blind worm. Following what? Fate, perhaps? A nation has no honor. It has no word to keep. Hitler himself is the nation. That, incidentally, is why Hitler always has to talk so loud, even in private conversation, because he is speaking with 78 million voices." So there's a great movie called A Dangerous Method. And this is about the relationship of Carl Jung and Freud, and Keira Knightley, of course. And Michael Fassbender plays Carl Jung. And they have at first, a great pedagogy. And Freud considers Carl Jung a very promising student, and they agree on a lot of things, and they're both deeply committed to the idea of the mind and trying to investigate the mind and its components. The way a physicist tries to crunch the atom, they wanted to break down the mind. But then they really crashed over the ideas of sex. And reductionism in philosophy, but I think mostly they kind of clashed on the idea of sex. So they had quite a falling out, and it makes for a pretty good movie that's worth watching. Now, he had another person that was really interested in synchronicities and wrote quite a lot about it, and was a friend and a fellow homeboy of Wolfgang Pauli, of Carl Jung, Wolfgang Pauli. Now, he is one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century. And he came up with this idea, most famous for the Pauli exclusion principle. So this idea that quantum numbers, that electrons can't occupy the same space and they have to have opposite spins. And it gives the idea of how the electrons actually structure themselves in the atom. It's really, really profound physical insight, and considered a genius by all of his peers and contemporaries. And he's one of these guys who got his PhD at age 21, and he graduated high school at 18. That's a lot of intellectual hustle in 3 years. Wolfgang Pauli is one of these guys who had quite a double life. So in addition to being this great physicist, come up with the Pauli exclusion principle relatively young, getting a PhD young, getting all kinds of respect, he was an avid drinker, a serious womanizer, and would get in bar fights, and was kind of messed up. His mom committed suicide when he was a kid, and his father was kind of not the greatest of fathers, and part of the reason mom committed suicide was because of the father's adultery. And so he did his best to hang in there, and he kept his career together. And in his 30s, he was going through a divorce and having some trouble. And this is actually when he got to know Carl Jung. And so he was in the market for a therapist, and that's how he got to meet Carl Jung. And this is where his interest in synchronicities really started to kick in. So Wolfgang Pauli, for a physicist, is one of these guys that I really like. These scientists that had a half mystical worldview, that had a little bit of a sense of the mystery that I appreciate so much. And when he met Carl Jung, his whole world, his intellectual world, just blossomed. He had dreams and visions. I mean, he was going through some sort of personal torture at the same time. He was not having a good time of it in life. And he considered himself at the time to be on the edge. But he was having all kinds of visions and all kinds of insights about physics and about the world. And he became obsessed with this idea of synchronicities. And he saw a lot of synchronicities in his own life. And what's interesting that he did this, and this was something that Carl Jung did with a lot of his patients. He has them draw mandalas, which are sort of these symmetric symbolic diagrams that show certain features that you're trying to convey in your life. And so I have a picture here of Wolfgang Pauli's mandala that he drew with Carl Jung. Now, I would, if I had to go to I probably do need some therapy, but Carl Jung would be a good therapist to go to. And I don't know, looking at the evidence, I don't know how much progress they really made on Wolfgang Pauli's love life, but they definitely both had a really interesting friendship and a really fruitful intellectual collaboration. Wolfgang Pauli. So the thing that I first became really interested with Wolfgang Pauli is something that it actually goes along with the idea of synchronicities and the influence of consciousness and complex systems, which is something we revisit on Vanadium frequently. There was something called the Pauli effect. And Wolfgang Pauli was known among the scientists as being a guy that if he was coming around the lab, he was a theoretical physicist, so he didn't come around the lab that much. But when he did, you had to basically turn off your equipment, and some people would put leaded shielding up because they thought that he had some kind of cosmic rays. Because he was known to walk into the room and just have if they had a complex experiment going, something electrical, something electronic, it was just going to go to shit. And this was actually called, affectionately, the Pauli effect in the lab. So it was, when he came around, hide your equipment, folks. But it's interesting. People have heard of Heisenberg from Breaking Bad. Well, Werner Heisenberg, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, was another one of these physicists that has a little bit of a mystical bent. But what's interesting is he and Pauli just hated each other. And from what I understand, Heisenberg didn't get along with Carl Jung either. So these guys, they have all these little beefs. It's quite the little schoolyard back then. So this is a quote from Wolfgang Pauli, and he and Jung really saw eye to eye on this. It seems to me one has to postulate a cosmic order of nature, outside of our arbitrariness, to which outer material objects are subjected as are the inner images. The organizing and regulating has to be posited beyond the differentiation of physical and psychical. I am all for it to call this organizing and regulating archetypes. It would then be inadmissible to define these as psychic contents. Rather, the above-mentioned inner pictures, dominance of the collective unconscious, are psychic manifestations of the archetypes, but which would have to produce and condition all natural laws belonging to the world of matter. The natural laws of matter would then be the physical manifestation of the archetypes. That's kind of confusing. And this is not, he was a great physicist, but that quote is kind of confusing. Another interesting thing about Wolfgang Pauli, and I don't think I butchered that. Butchered the read a little bit of that, I have to admit, but I may leave that in, but I think you get the bent. He had a really mystical bent on things. And what's another thing about Pauli is he had this fear of the number 137. And it ended up that he was brought to hospital room 137 and where he died. And he fought to not be put into this room, but he was put in that room, and that was actually where he died. So can you call that a synchronicity right at the end for Wolfgang Pauli? Here's a good synchronicity, because this is definitely this is a romantic, meaningful coincidence. A little Vanadium romantica. I'm reading this from 67 Not Out website. This is a website that has stories of synchronicity and other mysteries. For the romantics out there, I'm sure there must be a few. This is a coincidence story, which also doubles as a love story. It goes back to 1944. A young man, Antony Nowak, just 14 years of age, was in a concentration camp in Poland, one of the many injustices of World War II. Through the high fence, he often saw a girl of similar age, and over the weeks they became on talking terms. She was Polish and asked him if he was hungry. He told her he was. The following day she brought him an apple, which he managed to squeeze through the fence and barbed wire. They chatted until the girl had to go home. After this, the girl would try to walk past the camp fence, most days looking out for Antonin. She always had an apple in her pocket for the young man, and he looked forward to their conversations. It became his strength to get through each day. After many visits, with tears in his eyes, he told her not to come to see him anymore, as he was being transferred to another concentration camp. They said their sad goodbyes, and Antonin believed he would never see her again. He realized, as she walked away for a final time, that he didn't even know her name. He called after her and asked her what she was called. She said it was Antonina, and he realized the similarity to his own. Eventually, the war ended, and Antonin was released from the camp. He didn't really keep in touch with any of his camp comrades. Once he was of the right age, he decided to emigrate for a better life. He was unsure where to go, England or the USA. Finally, he chose the USA. He settled into American life, but never found romance. In 1957, he found his newfound friends in the U.S. were so frustrated at his lack of success that they, in the love department, they fixed him up with a blind date. He had never met the young woman Anita before, and during dinner he told her about his life in the concentration camp. It was as if he knew those pale blue eyes. She in turn told him how she was in Poland about that time, and used to take a tall, thin boy apples most days. Straight away they realized their connection, and immediately the feelings for each other flowed. Tears of joy followed, and Anita told him how she had changed her name from Antonina. That night, after just seeing Antonina for a few hours, Antonin proposed to her and said he never wanted to lose her again. She must have felt the same because a few short weeks later they married. They are now in their early 80s and have lived happily together as was intended, raising a family and a new dynasty in the U.S. Coincidences can change lives and sometimes place us back on the road we should have traveled. I kind of like that. So there's, in a way, everybody thinks about evil destinies that you can't escape, but there are wonderful destinies as well. But on the evil, horrible note, this example of a sort of a artistic synchronicity. And there are other examples of this, of psychic art. So there's no relation to Kramer, but there was a great sculptor, Michael Richards, and he had his most famous piece of art, this picture that I'll show you right here. You can see him in bronze, and there's a bunch of planes flying into his body, piercing his skin. And he was killed in the World Trade Center on 9/11. So that's, I think, one of those scary synchronicities. Terence McKenna gives a great talk on synchronicities. So he talks about, he tells a story. Here's a quote. "I have lived 42 years of my life, and on only 2 occasions have matchbooks mysteriously caught fire in my pocket." And on those 2 occasions were the times that he is planning to do DMT. Now that's having, they transport matches in big crates filled to the brim. They put them on trucks, and they store them in warehouses. And this never really happened. So Terence McKenna, I don't know what's going on. You're electric, man. Now, I got to be a little bit of a square for a minute here. Now, there is something that's a real thing, and it's called confirmation bias. And so you can, if you're looking for a pattern and you're looking hard enough and long enough, you will find that pattern. And that, it makes sense. So I'm going to give just an example here. And this is kind of a very simple view, but just consider you have one die. 6 faces, 6 different possibilities, 6 numbers, 1 through 6. So let's say you want it, the number you want. Let's say you want to roll a 2. What are the chances you're going to get 2? You're going to roll a 2 4 times in a row. Well, it's not 1%. It's not 0.1%. It's 0.07%. So that's, that's pretty low. So that's, if you were picked out some dice and you were to say to yourself, you know what, I'm going to decide whether or not I'm going to do this or that based on whether or not I roll 4 2s in a row. So way less than, 1%. So, that's be significant, I think. And you could say subjectively, perhaps meaningful. But I just like to, give an example of, if you were to roll that and get it once, it's certainly possible. But let's say you were to try forgive me, this calculation may not be exactly right. I figured it in 10 seconds for a roll of the dice. And I realized that the number of times would have to roll would depend on your sort of previous successes and whether or not you give up after 1 or 2 rolls if you didn't succeed in generating several in a row. All that aside, you really could generate, not a certainty, but you can make probability go work and get on your side if you, were to roll for, say 14 hours or getting close to 24 hours. You might be able, if you were asked that question and be willing to wait for that answer, you would get it eventually. So there, you have to figure out where to draw the line in all this in your interpretation. And that's one of the things that the I Ching, that whole system is really good at. I believe in these things and these synchronicities. And I've had a few things in my own life. And they've been, and I may even just go into the stories one day, but I've had a few sort of strange things that have happened at really critical times. And they're it's some of the reasons why I'm not strictly a materialist. And I do have a little bit of a mystical worldview. But anyway, I believe in synchronicities. But it's one of those things that it's difficult to even define what it really is, at least in any kind of, really concrete way. But I think there's something there. And I'm going to start playing around more with the I Ching, because it does feel like there's something going on there. And, it really has withstood the test of time. So there's got to be something to it. So thank you all very much. This has been Vanadium. Stay safe, everyone.